Well, thank you everyone for joining this ISS webinar on the geopolitics of the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. We're delighted that you were able to join us, and I'm particularly pleased to have 4 excellent speakers on this. My name is Emil Hkayem. I'm the Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the ISS. My specialty is Northern Middle East, so I'm like you here to learn from our excellent panelists. The Red Sea is emerging as a strategic space after being in a way forgotten for some time. And there's a number of reasons for that. Issues of regional security, transitions in the region, greater economic engagement by the Gulf states, more assertive Eastern African governments, greater organization among countries in the region, but also enduring sources of conflict. For every good news, we have a potential source of conflict, not necessarily active conflict, but a source of tension. So last year, years ago, we were all very happy to see the Eritrea-Ethiopia peace deal, and we'll talk about how strong and sustainable that deal is and what the returns on it are and will be. And in parallel, we're all reminded that, for instance, the perennial issue of the waters of the Nile is also a defining driver of regional politics. The region at one point was defined by the hard security threat that it faced: piracy, terrorism, conflict. In the past decades, people were more interested in the economic opportunities and whether integration was going to help smooth all those issues and lift all these countries economically and otherwise. The 4 panelists are Ambassador Mohammed Ali Guyo, who's the Special Envoy for the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and Somalia for IGAD. Hafsa Halawa is an independent analyst currently in Egypt, who covers the region. Camille Lons is my colleague at the ISS, who covers Gulf Asia relations as well as Gulf Red Sea relations. And Julian Riley is the Special Envoy for the SCDO. And the is very, very important and relevant in this context for the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to the various speakers first and ask them a few questions about their specific region, and then we'll engage in a discussion and take questions from the audience. This is on the record, and please feel free to ask your question using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So let me start with Ambassador Ali Guyo, who will basically help us understand the strategic importance of the region seen from the perspective of IGAD, a major regional grouping, and also individual states. So, Ambassador, the Red Sea and Horn of Africa have seen significant development in the past 2 years, and you are engaged on almost every one of them. Transition in Sudan, peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia, upcoming elections in Somalia, peace agreements in South Sudan, etc. But one still senses that this progress is fragile and possibly reversible. Can you help us understand where these stabilization processes are at the moment and how you're working to reinforce some of these peace deals? Importantly, given that they're supposed to happen in the near future, can the Somalia elections be, in a way, a turning point for Somalia, but also in terms of a regional architecture? And finally, how does IGAD think about the regional security architecture? The countries that need to be drawn into the security architecture, and others that perhaps need to be kept at length. So thank you for sharing your thoughts about the regional security architecture, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emily, for this introduction and opportunity to participate in this webinar, which is a very important topical for the Horn of Africa region and beyond. In fact, just to set the scene, it is important to recognize the fact that the Horn of Africa has always been in transition, in political transition, in security transition. It is also an area that has had environmental impact in terms of climate change and all manners of issues that has impact on human security as a whole, displacement, migration that breed conflict, and also the fact that the Horn of Africa is also a theater of both state and non-state actors, global ones outdoing each other, as you know, Al-Qaeda, and then the global war on terror, and all this. But the region is not static. It is a region that is in transition. It is a transition that brings about transformation in politics, in economy, and in many things. We also need to recognize the fact that there's a lot of diversity in terms of taking for people to take issues in their hand. Look at, for example, the participation of women, minority ethnic group, youths, and so on, in political project to bring about transition in Sudan, to bring about transition in Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. So, well, as far as stabilization is concerned, the stabilization is also in process, both in positive and in negative terms. But the whole thing also depends on in the internal dynamics within the Horn, as well as issues that also come from outside the Horn, extra-regional. Where is the stabilization at the moment, and how can it be supported? The stabilization, as I said, is in progress. You will find that the situation in Sudan is inching. You know, there's a trickling of good things that is happening. Somalia, the same thing. Upcoming election, a roadmap has been created for that. Excellent. I mean, to some extent. Then also you have Somaliland dialogue, which is also something a work in progress, and it is something that requires support both from within the region and outside the region. Ethiopia, Eritrea, the same thing. So the stabilization is in progress. The stabilization has also brought about something like a painkiller for the region. But the question is, how can we ensure that we have a sustainable, solution to this? Because the stabilization process is being threatened by internal dynamics in each of the member states of IGAD. Just to highlight one, Kenya is also in a process of building bridges initiative. An initiative that came out of last general election. So the question is, how can this stabilization, internal dynamics come in concert to prosper the region? So we have got a diversity within all the member states, different interests from different actors within, and all of them with the different political calculation. And also, just to emphasize that the prize for each, political group is to lead the country, but the seat is one. So how do we ensure that there is institutionalization of dispute resolution that will take care of any dispute that arises from within the member states? Like, for example, the state building process should move in earnest in Sudan, should be strengthened in Somalia, should also start building and also being strengthened in South Sudan, because it is this state building process, institutionalization and capacity building within the member states, that will ultimately solve this process of stabilization and beyond. Like, for example, Somalia, can it deliver a stable election? A roadmap has been created by all actors. It was initially unimaginable for actors to come together and deal with these issues, but it is still work in progress. We are monitoring, we are evaluating, thanks to international partners and the region, that we are all reading from the same page as far as stabilization of in Somalia is concerned, and also as far as the value of election in Somalia is concerned. Because one thing that Somalia has always had is, after the state collapse in 1991, there has been peaceful transfer of power at every juncture in electioneering process. So this one should not be different. This is what we emphasize as partners, so that we are able to have all the stakeholders move in one direction towards peace. Now, as far as Ethiopia is concerned, Ethiopia, yes, there is a lot. 27 years of rule under one party is not really something that is easy. To now there is a lot of diversity of political actors that has come up. Issues has come up. Some of these issues have been there for really quite some time. Historical issues is being is what the country is looking at. Now the question is now, can Ethiopia play its regional role? Ethiopia has always been an anchor in the Horn of Africa. It's an anchor state. It is a country with a population of 100 million plus. It is also one of the big countries in the region. It is also a historical country. Despite its internal problems, ever since, from history, Ethiopia has always played an anchor state role. It has always, ensured stability of the region by having its own stability. Because instability in Ethiopia can actually bring about serious political and security and say all manners of things. It's going to be having a very serious impact in the region and beyond. So the question now is how the Ethiopian leadership will be able to play that anchor state role, so that it will be able to prosper beyond what is currently facing. Now, as far as IGAD perspective is concerned on Somalia, the external actors in Somalia has been moving, issues sometimes brought about crisis in Somalia ever since before the state collapse and also after the state collapse. And even currently, there is a lot of interest in Somalia. So both the states within the region, the Gulf and beyond, there's been a lot of interest, to the extent that during the fallout in the Gulf, one of the areas that felt immediate impact was Somalia. And the region has come out strongly in support of Somalia through its own back channel, through its own goodwill and solidarity, that Somalia is cushioned properly from the impact of these external actors. Because if the region doesn't play that role, then once Somalia, one of the immediate beneficiary of any impact of these external, actors that brings about crisis in Somalia is Al-Shabaab. Therefore, it is in the best interest of the region to do that. And of course, there is also the rise of regional actors in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, especially from the Gulf states. Acquisition of ports, militarization of the Red Sea. These are some of the issues that has been going on for really quite some time. And most importantly, recently, The new actors are in the scene. The old actors are there. The new actors are there. Some are visible, some are invisible. So all of them, they are in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden. So they are there for political reasons. They are there for security reasons. They are also there for economic reasons. Now, in addition to the state actors, we also have non-state actors that moves into the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden, beyond the Horn of Africa, beyond the Gulf, and so on. So these are some of the issues, that is important for us to understand, because look, ISIS, we have ISIS in the Middle Eastern part, but we also have the ISIS enclave in northern part of Somalia, for example, in a place called Galgala Mountain. Look at, for example, the impact of the war in Yemen and how it provides both human resource and also material resources to non-state actors in Somalia and other parts of the Horn of Africa. So these are issues which are very critical for us to really dissect and see. These are the key stabilizing points once we are able to understand and have a clear intervention points. Now, one last bit on this aspect is about China. For example, look at China, the new entrant in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden. It has come up with a road belt initiative, which is a very important global mega infrastructure that has captured the human imagination, passing all the way from China through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden, and then the transit beyond Suez Canal and into Mediterranean. So this is an important, it's an important infrastructure that has political connotation, and also it has some security and diplomatic and economic, character, so to speak. So let me leave it at that for the time being, and then I will wait for question and answers.
Yeah, let me just get back to you on one issue. You mentioned the Eastern African states dealing with a variety of actors, including the Gulf states. Do you think that the IGAD countries are in a position to enter win-win transactions and relationship with the Gulf states, or is there a lack of solidarity or cohesion among the states that makes them perhaps a bit more vulnerable, or the weaker part in their negotiations that they're dealing with, Saudi or the UAE or Qatar? And related to that, what is the perception in the capitals, Addis Ababa and others, about the Gulf influence? I suspect, at some levels it's very welcome. At others, it is a bit concerning, because there's no necessarily good sense of what exactly those states want out of the relationship. So I'm curious to get your sense about the perception of Gulf powers in the region. You're on mute, Ambassador. Can you please unmute?
Yeah, let me start with the perception of the Gulf in the region. The interaction between the Gulf and the Horn of Africa is historical. It has been there even before the advent of modern states in the Horn of Africa region. So it has been religious, it has been economic, it has been political, it has been migration, and it has been, interaction in many ways, cultural, so to speak. So that interaction has also metamorphosized during this modern state relationship on both sides of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden. And the Gulf has contributed a lot to the Horn of Africa region. And of course, the Horn has also contributed a lot to, in terms of labor migration, in terms of many things, to the Gulf area. But throughout, the relation has always been bilateral. So bilateral relation has been very much at the core of this relation that has been driving states within the region and also states in the Gulf. So the perception, therefore, is that for those who have bilateral relations, it is okay. And of course, there are also certain issues which also comes up, that how is this bilateral relationship conducted? Is it structured bilateral relationship, or is it on the basis of personal relationship between leaders? So bilateral, it's a mix. It's a hybrid of both personal relations as well as bilateral structured engagement. Now, with regards to, therefore, is it possible to win-win situation between the Gulf and the Horn of Africa? This is debatable, but I can say that as far as economic terms, in economic terms, of course, the is asymmetrical. So there's an asymmetrical relationship, economic terms. The Gulf region is well endowed economically than the Horn of Africa region. So therefore, the power relation is skewed towards the Gulf, so to speak. But now, in order to cure this, it is therefore important that a multilateral approach kicks in, so that there is a collective voice among the IGAD member states, a collective, common understanding on issues of interest without undermining the sovereignty of member states. IGAD is therefore propping up a multilateral initiative, especially on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, that will be able to engage at a multilateral level with the eastern side of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So it is on this basis that the Red Sea Task Force for IGAD was established to formulate a regional plan of action for IGAD member states, and also for convention for the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden for IGAD member states, and therefore to put IGAD voice on one platform to engage the Red Sea Council based in Saudi Arabia, which has also members from some from Horn of Africa, from also others from the Gulf area, so that interaction can be on multilateral basis, so that we upgrade it beyond the bilateral one. We hope that on the multilateral basis, we'll be able to craft a win-win approach on issues within the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm sure we're going to come back to this issue, and I expect that my colleague Kemi will cover it as well from the perspective of the Gulf states. Let's move to the giant to the north, Egypt and Hafsa. I mean, the first point I want to make is that I really hope that Room Rater is watching this, because I think Hafsa will get a 10 out of 10. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're missing out on one of the most interesting Twitter accounts out there. But Hafsa, I'm glad we have one person 10 out of 10 here. More seriously, President Trump a couple of days ago reminded us that for those who didn't follow, that there is a actually ongoing issue, that pits, two or possibly three of the region's giants against each other. The issue of the Nile River and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And this is a matter that has attracted a lot of interest. There is a lot of speculation, and you'll tell us whether it's founded or not, that Egypt is so concerned about the impact on water flows that it will and it is considering military action. But in the meantime, let's not speculate too much and focus on what is actually happening, which is, diplomacy, mediation, not necessarily working well, and we'll talk about this. But can you please update us on where the dispute stands, and whether the mediation really has a chance? I mean, it seems like the parties are committed to a diplomatic agreement. That the alternative is just simply disastrous. But I'm also curious, from your perspective, what is Egypt's leverage in all this? I mean, how is Egypt thinking about the region? Is this the dominant issue for Egypt, or is it part of a constellation of issues, including the Red Sea, including Gulf of Aden, and so on? And so how does Egypt think about this issue, and how does it place it on its broader regional agenda? And thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Emil, and thanks for the props. I'll be sure to tell my family, of whom I'm borrowing some space today. Thank you for the question. I think I'll start with a bit of a sort of warning / caveat. When we talk about the GERD and we talk about mediation specifically, I think it's very dangerous to believe that any of the processes we've seen, particularly in the last 12 months, are active mediation. It is facilitation, it is observation, particularly on a part of the World Bank, the US government, and now the African Union. And we are not actually, and have never been at a point where talks have been mediated by an external partner. So part of that problem is actually a microcosm of the broader GERD dispute, which is that the countries simply cannot agree on anything. We've had years of stalled negotiations, particularly when, if I'm honest, conditions were much more favorable to Egypt to get a better deal than the one that looks like, that would be presented. Over the years, we've had a rather, in some respects, a positive transfer of power in Addis. The leadership of Abiy Ahmed certainly presented opportunities to Egypt, less hostile environment in Addis to engage with. We've had the uprising in Khartoum, which some might argue has lent to a confused picture from Sudan. I actually think the Sudanese have been very strong in possibly playing the actual mediator role in this current dispute. The reality is that, to be quite frank, and it's not a popular opinion to have in Cairo, where I'm currently talking to you, but Egypt dragged its heels. Egypt had opportunities across the board since the Declaration of Principles was signed in 2015 to come to more favorable terms than that currently on offer to it. It has stalled. Slow construction has helped that. Different weather patterns, changes of power ultimately in Addis and Sudan that have followed the transfer of power we've seen, or the change in power we've seen in Cairo earlier on in the decade. So it has had an abundance of opportunity that, unfortunately, to be quite frank, it's squandered. On top of that, I would argue, and I will mention the very technical points of the dam that might be important to those not following. But on top of that, we have had a, nationalism on steroids, I would say, particularly out of Cairo and Addis in the last 12 months. What that has done is that it has entrenched opinion, public opinion, general public. It is not for international or regional consumption. It is for domestic consumption. What that does, however, is that leaves all sides politically entrenched further away from each other and less likely to compromise. What has come out of that in the last 12 months, quite expectedly, simply because of conditions on the ground vis-a-vis the construction of the dam and basic geography, is that Egypt has had to concede far much more than it would have liked to. The two outstanding issues that continue to plague these talks, having had Egypt concede on longer-term water management and Nile negotiations, and engage on discussions related to just the fill schedule of this reservoir that sits behind the dam structure itself, is two issues. It's a drought mechanism for the years that we expect drought during the fill, which Egypt did originally want as a permanent application to broader water management, and Ethiopia refused to engage on that. And that the agreement, and that these mechanisms engaged in the agreement be legally binding. Now, to be quite frank, these are not unreasonable requests. I personally believe, and unfortunately across the aisle, there's constant back and forth. It's become quite difficult for counterparts in any of the tripartite countries to engage without a tit-for-tat kind of discussion. But I do believe that the Washington Agreement, insofar as it was put forward, was quite a fair and balanced agreement, arguably, possibly the best agreement that we were going to get. And now it's been a case of backsliding. There is argument on both sides that each side is not an honest broker, and we're talking here Egypt and Ethiopia. Sudan itself has a mixed hybrid, different leaders in different positions vis-a-vis whether they ally with Egypt more or ally with Ethiopia. However, I think, Sudan actually stands to have in the fallout of what would happen without an agreement, arguably is the most exposed and most vulnerable of the tripartite countries. Unfortunately, because of this nationalist rhetoric, because of the fervent nationalism felt across Ethiopia and across Egypt, we are back to a debate where we're still talking about colonial era agreements, water share, water allocation. And again, to be fair, Egypt's position in 2007 through to 2010 should not be lauded. It wanted effectively a veto right. It wanted to stop this dam, but has shifted significantly since 2015. It has come a very long way. It has made massive concessions on its part. Some might argue being quite unfair for Egypt to have to make. Others in order to keep the conversation going. Where do we stand now? I personally take the view that it is not really of major relevance to the talks what President Trump thinks. If anything, the major harm done by his comments is to US-Ethiopia relations, and not necessarily impact on the tripartite negotiations. It has always been an inherently regional, local issue for the countries. The African Union has made its position very clear how it engages with the countries, as have other international organizations and multilateral institutions, as they have periodically engaged, including the UN Security Council. The announcement or proclamation that Egypt should bomb the dam, green light or not, certainly my understanding is that Egypt has never really seriously considered military action on the dam. Not only is it logistically quite difficult, if not unfeasible, for a number of reasons. It's not in anyone's interests to start a water war, to be engaged in a regional war, and ultimately Egypt has very little leverage, if any. And that's, again, not a popular opinion in Cairo. There is the argument that I think is fair that Ethiopia has at times, particularly in the last 6 to 9 months, very much looked to stall the negotiations, try and accelerate conditions on the ground, including extra or heavier rains, causing a natural start of the fill of the reservoir, if you would. However, the reality is, unfortunately for Egypt, is that Ethiopia's actions can be classed as bad diplomacy. They can be classed as bad policy and practice for both regional security and its own domestic security. However, the reality is, and it's quite a simple fact, is that by geography, Egypt is the furthest downstream country among the Nile Basin countries. And it has very little, if any, leverage at all. And sort of leading towards your question on Red Sea security, there are a number of actors involved in the region, allies of Egypt, arguably what Egypt would call adversaries of it, and everybody has different interests. There are diverging interests even among alliances, and that's creating a very it's providing Egypt with fewer allies than it would have liked on this issue particularly.
Very, very interesting point, and I'll be curious later to hear if Camille has some insights about how the Gulf states are trying to navigate this one. Good relations or improving relations with Ethiopia, with supposedly a strong partnership with Egypt. So let me ask you, is Egypt's main source of leverage right now its relationship with the U.S. in the hope that the U.S. will, it may be totally irrelevant, but it's a genuine question because I've heard it. So that's number one. The second one is that, Egypt, now its immediate neighborhood is quite crowded. There's a number of powerful states, including Saudi, including Turkey, which is an adversary, and so on, operating. It's an immediate neighborhood. So how does Egypt try to organize this, and how does it try to shape this engagement by other regional actors? Is it by anchoring itself, presenting itself as, the pivotal state and everything needs to be built around it? Is it by actually being a more flexible power, trying to actually shape, what others are doing in the region in quite subtle ways? I'm just curious about this because what happens in, the northern Red Sea will have an impact on the southern Red Sea. And so, yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, I think it's actually quite interesting when we talk a lot about Egypt's foreign policy in the region, in the Horn of Africa region, East Africa region. So much of it, and even the response from those countries itself is always like, oh, all Egypt cares about is the Nile. And the GERD or water resources generally. And I think really up until about 2015, that was very true. I think a lot of the foreign policy, all of Egypt's trajectory towards that region with its re-engagement post the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak was very much about water. It was very much about the Nile. However, there are some basic factual realities. Egypt's water scarcity problem is not merely an issue that is resolved by some form of resolution on this issue of the GERD. And President Sisi has very much sought to re-engage with Africa in a very different way and really very actively. It is a case of personality politics to some extent. There is sort of, I think it's not discounted that there is some view to Ethiopia in the rearview mirror at times, but it's also about establishing Egypt as a regional security partner for other countries. Personal relationships built with Museveni, Afwerki, Salva Kiir, these kinds of relationships that on the one hand can be read as antagonizing and Ethiopia primarily, but on the other hand, as well as when you take into account leadership of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union last year, relations with the Gulf, relations with China in Egypt and moving down into the region. Egypt is, I think the last 10 years have really been an evolution of Egypt trying to figure out where it fits in the region. The Middle East really is a theater where Egypt no longer is relevant. That is impacted ever more by the normalization agreements with Israel. Egypt has been for decades the partner that Israel has to turn to naturally for resolution, particularly on Gaza, for example, but also broadly within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Egypt and Jordan have been those mainstays. Jordan has had to deal with its role in the Syria conflict and Iraq as well as the years have gone on. Egypt doesn't have a role to play there. And, broader security, broader energy ambition in the East Med, in the Red Sea, the deals with Saudi Arabia, exploration rights in the Red Sea, the control and the expansion of Suez, trying to really propel itself with its strategic location, sell itself to its Gulf partners, because ultimately, the facts are there. Egypt has had an incredible economic crisis over the last 10 years. It has, despite its population, despite the potential that exists, has become much more of a burden than an opportunity for many of its allies who have supported it. And really, the only thing it has to sell to anyone, be it Saudi, China, or the US, is where it sits geographically in Africa and in the Middle East. It's Suez, it's about the Red Sea, it's about East Med. It has its own national security concerns, notably in Libya, also in Sudan, as well Sinai and the Rafah border with Gaza. But these have been at various times, the concerns, or rather the priorities, fluctuate based on the relationship. And I would primarily actually prioritize the UAE-Egypt relationship over Egypt-Saudi, particularly in Libya, but also more broadly speaking, the UAE has been a much smoother, stronger, broader ally of Egypt than I would say Saudi Arabia has. Plus on the fact that citizen to citizen relationships, the UAE has better relations across the board there are always that lingering tension vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. And Egypt is having to contend with the fact that it is not the only player in town. There have always been strong relationships with the Gulf in the Horn of Africa, but the urgency of those relationships is increasing as climate change develops, particularly in the realm of food security, and as offshoots of that broader economic security primarily. And that's diverging from Egypt's interests vis-a-vis water security and its own national security concerns. And primarily for me, where the Gulf actors or all the different diverging relationships can or could threaten to collide is Sudan. And my biggest fear for the region writ large is the future for Sudan without broader backing from, say, the developed states, whether it be the EU, the US, or otherwise, and what might happen if those parties are all left to, say, fight it out for themselves and trying to challenge for power in Sudan. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Hafsa. Very useful tour d'horizon, and quite useful because you also set the stage for Camille. So we're turning east right now to the Gulf states, and have a perspective. Camille, I think Room Rater will give you 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10. We'll have to work on that. So Camille sits in Manama at our office there, and let me ask you. I mean, we've heard a lot from Hafsa and Ambassador Ali Bouyo about the Gulf states' role. They've inserted themselves in the politics of Eastern Africa. Can you walk us through what the key interests of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular are, and how they pursue those interests up until now?
Thanks, Emil, and thanks for having me. So this interest of Gulf states in the Horn is not something new, and as Ambassador Aguirre was saying, they have a long-standing historical relationship with the Horn of Africa, but we're definitely seeing a comeback of the Red Sea and the Gulf political agenda since past decade or so, and there are different reasons for that. There is, of course, the economic opportunities, the booming consumer markets, access to agricultural lands. The fact that the Red Sea is a crucial trade corridor, especially with the context of the Chinese Belt and Road. This is becoming even more important for these Gulf states. There's the security dimension, although piracy has been curbed recently, but it could reemerge, and maritime security issues remain an important problem. The Yemen war has been also a compounding factor with the need to gain a military foothold. But probably the most crucial factor that is driving the renewed Gulf engagement in the region is the reemergence of the Red Sea as an arena of geopolitical contest. And it's a contest between regional powers. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been quite concerned by the growing influence of Iran initially, but also Turkey and Qatar. And so a big part of that renewed interest in the region has been motivated by the need to counter those external rivals. But beyond also the regional competition, there is a broader great power politics playing in the Red Sea, with China opening a base in Djibouti, and the Red Sea and Western Indian Ocean kind of appearing as the prolongation of a broader strategic landscape. And so for the Gulf states trying to regain some control or influence in the development of this region, presenting themselves as important interlocutors is something that is crucial, especially recently with several African states going through important political transitions. There has been a kind of rush to try to influence those processes and to try to support establishment of friendly regime. And so the Gulf states have regained a lot of interest in the region. But I'm talking here about Saudi Arabia here and the UAE together because they're close strategic allies, but they also have their own set of interests and priorities that don't necessarily align all the time. Saudi Arabia really sees the Red Sea as its direct neighborhood, while the UAE sees it more through the lens of positioning itself on global trade routes. Although they've been partnering closely together, probably one could argue that Saudi Arabia is not too keen to see the UAE gaining too much influence in the area. Yeah, so they did that through like different instruments, mainly geo-economic instruments, but more recently, Saudi Arabia has been launching this Red Sea Council that aims to develop a multilateral platform for countries of the Red Sea. But this is an initiative that is eminently political, and we have to see how it will concretely take shape in the years to come.
Thank you, Kimi. I mean, I'm curious. Those two countries in particular, Saudi and the UAE, you know, there's a lot of expectation out of them, you know, from regional actors. They're seen as, you know, bringing investment, assistance, you know, opening markets, etc. But for them, the engagement in the region is not solely or primarily economic, I suspect, right? So, you know, and the politics of Eastern Africa are quite complicated. So how have they tried to navigate those politics? I mean, you know, the question from earlier, you have two big countries, Ethiopia and Egypt, that are at odds. If you're in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, how do you play this one? How do you position yourself on this one? The other one, for instance, is Sudan, where the Gulf states a year ago were in the hot spots, where, you know, they were, you know, seen as Deus ex machina, able to, you know, play politics in Khartoum. Was it really the case? And I suspect that, you know, their reputation and their political influence was engaged, and it was not necessarily a very comfortable position. So can you give us a sense of how they navigate the complexity of the region?
Sure. The problem is that sometimes we overestimate their understanding that Gulf states have of the region, and so they're trying to navigate the politics of the Horn, but they're themselves having a limited understanding of the local dynamics. Especially to come back on the tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia, this is definitely a big challenge for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because they have really tried to operate a rapprochement with Ethiopia over recent years. They see it as a key power in the Horn. It would be difficult for them to really gain influence in the broader region without Ethiopia. And also they appreciate Abiy Ahmed from a personal level as a leader. But as Egypt remains too important for them. I agree with Hafsa that Egypt has lost a little bit in strategic importance from the Gulf states, or at least their priorities have evolved over recent years, but they still consider that Egypt's stability is key to the stability of the region. The stability of the Suez Canal as well. And Egypt is also an important partner on other regional arenas, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean at the moment, on Libya. So they cannot afford not to support Egypt, and so they have supported Egypt. And on the Red Sea Council, they have tried as well to find a balance between these two powers, Egypt and Ethiopia. So Saudi Arabia has made a concession to Egypt by not including Ethiopia in the council, but somehow by taking over leadership on this initiative, which was originally an Egyptian initiative, they are hoping to manage as well Egypt from within the organization and shape a bit the agenda.
Thank you. You know, one question, we haven't said the word COVID-19 yet, so, you know, I feel a bit guilty of this as the chair. Will the pandemic, you know, compel the Gulf states to rethink their engagement? I mean, or is it not a factor?
So that is the big question in the years to come, because Gulf economies have been harshly hit by the pandemic, by the fall of oil prices, the financial reserves that they had and that had allowed them to extend influence in the region are shrinking. And we're seeing at the moment an inward movement that they're busy addressing the domestic challenges. And so there are important uncertainties on the extent to which Gulf countries are going to be able to maintain the same level of commitment to the region and continue the investments at the same pace. I don't think that the COVID crisis is constituting a shift here necessarily. I think it's more accelerating a trend that was already ongoing, because there has been a regional rush towards the Red Sea these past few years, but it seems that Gulf officials have tended to overstate a little bit their interest in the region and the strategic depth that they put in it. When we look at the UAE footprint in the Horn of Africa, it remains quite superficial, quite opportunistic. They're most of the time just trying to fill the space before other players, without necessarily thinking a deep long-term engagement with the region. The Saudi and Emirati investments in the region have been driven a lot by political objectives rather than economic interests, and so that has led to a lot of under-profitable investments or unsustainable for some of them. So the Sudan breadbasket, for example, was a very good example of this in the 70s. But even in Ethiopia today, they are realizing that a lot of the investments they've made there are not as profitable as was expected. On the military bases, there has been a lot of mediatic noise with a new base project being announced every month, but at the end of the day, not everything has materialized. The UAE base in Berbera is not happening. The Saudi base in Djibouti is taking a lot of time to really take off. And same thing as you mentioned on the political fronts, there has been some setbacks and some frustrations as well, partly also because they don't necessarily always understand the politics in the Horn. So whether it was in Sudan or the Eritrea-Ethiopia rapprochement that is stalling a little bit, or even the fact that they have backed Abiy Ahmed and the fact that he is now facing a lot of internal difficulties, and that could push the Gulf states to review their calculations in the region. So the COVID is accelerating those trends that were already ongoing before the pandemic. And it doesn't mean that Gulf states are going to lose interest in the region completely, but they are likely to recalibrate their engagement and review probably their priorities.
Thank you, Camille. So we went south, north, east, and now we're going to zoom out with Julian. I mean, first, Julian, you get high grades from Room Racer, I suspect. Nice carpet on the wall and the paintings. We'll discuss this at a later stage. But you're someone whose purview is quite broad at CDO. You know, looking at the region in its entirety and this web of relations. I mean, the first question I have for you is that there is a sense that the regional agenda is driven by local and regional actors, and that, you know, external players, you know, out of area players are secondary, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just curious from your perspective. I mean, you know, how much is done to support first those transitions that we were talking about, whether it's the peace agreements that now need to be implemented and where, you know, people are expecting returns from it, or you know, internal transitions like Sudan, elections in Somalia, you know, or in South Sudan. You know, to what extent is the international community, and in your specific case, the UK, engaged on these issues? And what is the main philosophy? I mean, what's the objective here? Economic integration, regional security agreements, a mix of both. So thank you again for joining, and go ahead.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to all of the other speakers. Coming last, I actually really want to talk about all the things that others have already spoken about, but I will answer your questions. And I think the first thing to say is actually, you know, is the UK interested or is the West involved? I think the fact that, you know, my role exists as the Red Sea and Horn of Africa envoy speaks to something. I think actually, if you also look about how these conversations have evolved over the last 2 or 3 years, for all of us, we are in a totally different place from where we were before. So actually, I think there is a much greater realization of the integrated nature of all of these issues and their challenges and the need to talk about them. So thank you also for pulling this panel together and asking these great questions. I also, since you mentioned it a couple of times, I'm the UK special envoy for this region. I previously worked to as many Whitehall departments as I can. I was in the FCO, I worked with DFID. I now belong in the FCDO, and I think actually that bringing together of diplomatic, political development, and even humanitarian support, sort of that fuller spectrum approach is actually much better suited to the challenges that we see in the Horn of Africa and the wider Red Sea arena, which is what I like to call that space. What are the West? What is the UK after? I think stability and prosperity in the Horn of Africa and the wider Red Sea arena are directly in our interests. So that's actually the driver. Are we more or less involved? We certainly shouldn't be dictating events. So it depends what you mean by involved. I think we're deeply engaged on it. And that's not just the sort of £1 billion or so of UK aid to the region annually, but it's actually about the way that we're developing partnerships, whether it's in trade, security, tackling crime, as well as supporting, and I think this is a key thing we need to talk about, inclusive economic development. Partnership is the key to that. And you raised that, Emil, in some of your questions, as did Ambassador Mohammed, about, I think it's really important to recognize, respect, and support the agency of the countries in the Horn of Africa and the region. So that's about listening and understanding what those countries need. I think it's also about recognizing the overlapping nature of the region. So where does the region begin and end? Egypt is fundamentally part of this region because it is a Red Sea state and it is a Nile state. And so I think Egypt's interests, have to be a vital part of that conversation too. The Gulf actually is also part of this wider Red Sea arena, but so is the West when you look at the maritime question. So I think, and on partnership, I think it's about adding value. So coordination and cooperation are two of the big words, which I hope that we can talk a little bit more about. You asked specifically about three of the subjects. So very briefly, I mean, Sudan's transition. Hassa, you made a point about, it could all come tumbling down. I think that is something that we all understood a year and a half ago. And also, I think Sudan is an African nation, it is an Arab nation, it is a Horn of Africa. I mean, it sits in so many different places that for Sudan's transition, brought about by the people of Sudan, to work, it's going to absolutely need the help and support of its friends in the West, its friends in the Arab world, and its friends and neighbors in Africa. And I think actually, if you look at the way the Friends of Sudan formed, the way they're these subgroups, the way that, Gulf partners stepped in as well to support that difficult moment last summer, I think there's also a huge opportunity, because also actually, I think that if we can all work together bilaterally, multilaterally, collectively, and help Sudan get to the right place, we've also proved a model, which actually then allows us to reverse the broader conversation around the Red Sea arena about talking about hard security and zero-sum games into looking at win-win. So I think it's a really important example. And just to say that, progress in Sudan is slower than people would like. Support for that transition is less and slower than Sudan would like, because we're all in a really difficult place. But it's happening, 800 million was raised at the Berlin conference. The Juba Peace Agreement has happened with support from a lot of different people in the region, by which I mean the Arab world, the West, IGAD, etc. There's a real pathway towards a big deal on debt relief and IFI finance. So Somalia, and Mohammed Guya touched on this as well. I mean, on the elections, the international community has been closely engaged in supporting progress towards the direct elections, which the Somali people and government committed to. So it's disappointing actually that these, we haven't got the model which this time round, which matches the commitments which the Somalis themselves made to themselves. So we're keen to see a pathway through towards future direct elections. But I think for now on that, it's really important, first of all, that everybody rallies round towards supporting an open and transparent political process. And that will require some changes in various places. And that we all work to support the agreed model, make sure it's timely, make sure it's inclusive. It's important that Somalia itself sets out clearly to the UN and others the support it needs in order to deliver on its commitments. But there we are. Lastly, I mean, on the country of Ethiopia, Egypt, I'd have settled out a lot on the GERD, which is part of a broader region around the Nile. And I think from a Western perspective, are we standing back or not? The UK has a position of sort of what we call active neutrality. I mean, all of the riparian states are close friends of the UK. We fully support the AU process. It's really good to see that has kicked off. There is a strong interest for everybody in an early agreement between the parties that respects everybody's interests and rights. Because done right, this dam can be a huge boost, not just for Ethiopia, but for the whole region. And I think that then speaks to the broader question around integrated approaches to development and to investment, which isn't just a Western concern. It concerns Gulf countries, and it's not just about what happens in Ethiopia or Sudan. It's also about what Egypt. There's a huge amount there which we could perhaps pick up on. I think in this question you also did, yes. I think AU and IGAD, just briefly. I mean, first of all, it's great to have my excellent colleague Dr. Mohammed on the line as well. IGAD, crucially important, I think, in this whole dynamic. As is the African Union, see both organizations as close partners. I think the work that IGAD have been doing on the Red Sea Task Force is very important. And then I'll just finish my answer to this question by just saying that wider coordination is really important. So 4 IGAD member states are members of the Red Sea Council. So there's a link there. PERSCA, so the Organization for the Protection of the Environment in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, based in Jeddah, actually brings together partners for the Arabian Peninsula and Horn. And there's some really topical issues there, like the Safar oil storage facility off Yemen, which is going to impact on countries in the Horn as well as countries in the Arabian Peninsula. Then there's things like the Djibouti Code of Conduct and the 2017 Jeddah Amendment, which really brings out the importance of the maritime space and the opportunities in that. So I'll stop there for this.
Certainly a very busy regional agenda. I can imagine that you miss being on planes and going from country to country to try to bring coherence or at least understand how all this overlaps and plays together. I work at the ISS. I have to ask the question: what are the hard security challenges that still keep your government, other governments, Eastern African governments, etc., awake? I mean, we see a decade ago it was about counter-piracy, concerns about proliferation, arms trade, etc. Obviously human trafficking and so on. It seems like in the past decades, the opportunities of the region have gladly dominated the conversation. If only we could figure out how to work together, and there's maritime wealth. There's the Eastern Africa is growing economically and so on. Have we forgotten the hard security agenda? Is that something that is on mind, or is it that now that there is a massive naval presence by quite important countries around the region, feels like, okay, this is, the big boys are essentially looking over that, the Americans, the French, the Chinese now, and some of the others. And so, it's been relegated.
No, I don't think so. And actually, It's a really important challenge. And there's a question around actually how you approach hard security threats. They're really serious. The terrorism problem. So Ambassador Guyo was bringing out, the problem of Al-Shabaab, the Daesh in the region. Piracy is suppressed. It hasn't been resolved. Take away those navies, piracy comes back, because the solution to piracy is not patrolling with massive navies. The solution to piracy is providing better economic solutions for the impoverished people in those isolated coastal towns, so that they don't need to resort to piracy, which they wouldn't do if they didn't have to. Serious organized crime is something which is not just impacting the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, it's stretching right down the Western Indian Ocean. Kenya, threatened by sort of narco trafficking, people trafficking. You've just this extraordinary nexus of problems. Al-Shabaab itself is a really significant regional threat and can only be resolved through regional security solutions. Part of that, I think, the narcotics, the arms smuggling, etc. I mean, it's all, part of it is symptomatic of the challenges, but I think that the solutions lie in taking a much more holistic approach, which brings me actually to the idea of tackling these through collective and integrated solutions, which, as I said previously, seems to me to be as much about inclusive economic development as it is about putting in hard security assets. So I like that bit in the Jeddah Amendment of the Djibouti Code of Conduct on recognizing the role of the blue economy. I like the fact that Kenya, a year and a half ago, had a big summit on the blue economy, because these are actually really good ways of tackling the hard security threats. And it'll be interesting to hear from IGAD how in the task force actually that is beginning to address it. Because actually, my proposition is that all of these hard security issues will not be solved if you just address them one by one, just as you will not resolve the individual security challenges in each of the states in the Horn of Africa by resolving them one by one. Actually, if you begin to look at the idea of integration, economic development, about cooperation on environmental security, if you think about Saudi Arabia's interests in stability, security, and cleanliness in the Red Sea in order to realize some of the mega projects in the Red Sea development program of Saudi Arabia, suddenly there's opportunities for a partnership. And that actually is perhaps a moment just to pick up the point which several of you have raised about asymmetry. There is a financial discrepancy between the ready cash on one side of the sea and the other. Sure, but actually there are problems which cannot be solved without partnership. And those partnerships will lead to inclusive economic development, which benefits the countries of the Horn and creates a better partner. So let's not separate the two out, I think is my plea.
Well, thank you, Julian. That's I think a very important point to make. I mean, ultimately, there is a lot that the Gulf states and others can actually bring to help their partners on the other side of the Red Sea. Let me turn to the questions right now. I mean, the first one I want to highlight is by Matthew Gordon, who brings up an important matter, which is that IGAD has a multilateral approach to the region, but it ignores one of the important actors in the region, Somaliland. And so the question is, how can IGAD's approach be considered robust and united if Somaliland is left out of this approach? And so that's one. The other one, I think, he brings up the issue of the Somalia dialogue, and says that in the past 8 years, the dialogue, since the dialogue started, it hasn't really delivered, and it's still at the early stages of that, and there's still a lot of bad blood, including over the upcoming election. So is this really progress on the front? And is there, can we envision a regional security architecture that ignores such an important littoral state. Ambassador, it's yours.
Excuse me, Emily, can you please repeat for me Somaliland dialogue, because there was some interruption.
Yeah. Mr. Gordon notes that the Somalia dialogue is not really an achievement. It's been 8 years and it's still at the very first stages. There's still a lot of bad blood between the two countries. So how can a regional security architecture be built if a littoral state like Somaliland is left out?
Thank you very much. Let me start with the multilateral approach and exclusion of Somaliland. On this one, I think it is important to note that Somaliland is still an entity that is looking for recognition. It's not yet recognized officially, and therefore international legal personality rests with the government in Mogadishu, which is a recognized entity as per the international law. So therefore, as far as Somaliland is concerned, this is still a work in progress. We are engaging with Somaliland, by the way. We are engaging. We have presence in Hargeisa, just like other partners, so to deliver on some developmental humanitarian aspect. And also we engage with also the government in Hargeisa. But as far as political recognition is concerned, it is still work in progress for them. So, but on issues of humanitarian, human security, and so on, definitely they will be engaged. And also, let me emphasize one aspect. On matters of regional security, that the region feels that Somaliland needs to be engaged, we engage. In fact, I have engaged Somaliland on a number of issues through shuttle diplomacy, especially on areas touching in a local place called Tukarak. Tukarak is a local place where clashes flared up in January 2018. Immediately we moved in because that is a historical area where, if you recall, the rise of Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan of around 1880, 1890, which brought about a similar, version of something similar to, the brand of, Islamic political movement that fought with the British and the multinational forces around that time. In fact, it is possible. First, Al-Shabaab also, they make reference to Mohammed Abdullah Hassan and others are some of the key points for them to whip up, the legacies, the emotions surrounding the legacy of that legendary figure. And therefore, when it comes to that issue called Tukarak, it's a local issue. It's a localized place, but it has got also regional and global implication as far as security is concerned. It is also near the Gulf of Aden because it's just some place up around Somaliland, Puntland border area. Therefore, we engage on matters of security issues. And when it comes to Somaliland dialogue, yes, first of all, we need to appreciate the fact that there's been a lull in negotiation, lull in dialogue from 2016 all the way up to somewhere around this year. Therefore, this is a good progress. For us, how do we count progress? We count progress on the basis of, one, the willingness for the parties to come together. Even if the parties, do not come together, directly, even indirectly, that is an achievement. But this one, the parties came together directly in order to look at some of the procedural matters of dialogue, agreeing on agenda, agreeing on a program of work. But I agree that the substantive issues have not been tackled. But this is work in progress. It is the first start. And we appreciate in the Horn of Africa, some of us who have dealt with South Sudan and Sudan process, we know achievement or success trickle in slowly by slowly, step by step, especially in this kind of negotiation that has got high stake for both entities. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. I mean, there's certainly, some hope that there is momentum in the region towards agreements. I mean, in the past couple of years, we followed peace agreement after peace agreement, and now, whether it's South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, that is the next, hopefully the next issue that can be addressed. Just going back to something that Julian mentioned on this one earlier. Is this a place where the tension, the dispute between Somalia and Somaliland, is this something that is better left for local and regional organizations to deal with, and not necessarily addressed head-on by broader powers or necessarily at the UN level with significant engagement? I mean, this is an example where perhaps actually, lower visibility by international organizations put the onus on regional actors, and where they have greater ownership and perhaps better drive to get to a resolution. Is that a fair point?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Very good. No, I mean, it's really interesting, this one, I think, and well done to those who've managed to make the progress this year on reviving the dialogue, which I think is a really important thing to happen. The UK, we have had our time trying to take this forward, as have others, and I think that. I think one of the lessons with Somaliland, which we also have a significant presence in Hargeisa, and while Ambassador Guya makes a very important point about sort of official recognition, etc., which must, I think, be driven by the region. By the way, it's not for outsiders to try to dictate that. I think in the same way, these agreements don't happen until there is local buy-in and then regional buy-in. So that does not absolve the wider international community of responsibility to support a process. So if I could just sort of briefly take, for instance, something which actually Mohammed and I have both in our past lives been engaged with, which was the comprehensive peace agreement for Sudan, back in, agreed in January 2005 after many years of work. That was an IGAD process. It was also supported by the UN. It was also supported by the Troika of the UK, US, and Norway. We all had our roles to play, but actually it was a regional process which could only happen anyway because actually the parties in Sudan decided that they wanted it to happen. So I think there's hierarchies of responsibility, and then there is a responsibility to support processes which are working. So yeah, and it's about, everything I said about agency and about localism. I think you have to take it that way round. You're on mute.
You would think that after all these webinars, I would know how to do it. Apologies. The word China was pronounced once, if my notes are accurate. So I want to go back to this and ask Camille, who spent half her time, looking at China's engagement in the region. There is a lot of fretting over what China does in the Middle East, whether it's in the Gulf region or elsewhere, and certainly Eastern Africa is a region of interest. Is it perhaps like in the Gulf? Is it a case that we're overstating what Chinese interests, what China is really doing? That every time there is obviously the Chinese base in Djibouti is significant because it is the only Chinese base in the region. But can you walk us a bit through what the Chinese are thinking in the region and what lessons they've learned from their engagement with local actors, but also other Middle Eastern actors that may make them more or less ambitious in what they're doing?
Sure, thank you. So when it comes to China's vision of the Red Sea, this is something that has been emerging and developing over recent years in the discourses. The Red Sea as a region itself was not even conceptualized that much from the Chinese leadership perspective. They had different people dealing with the Middle East and with Africa. And so, like for other administrations in the world, it's only quite recently that they have started really looking at the Red Sea as a region in itself. But beyond that, they have had a long-standing influence in the Horn, as they have a good relationship with the Gulf. The Red Sea is important for them in terms, of course, of global trade routes. They see it as a strategic region, but I wouldn't be able to really go in details of what their involvement is in the Horn because I mainly work on their involvement in the Middle East. But when it comes to the Middle East, there has been a lot of hopes from the Middle Eastern side in terms of what China could deliver in the region, and sometimes some over expectations a little bit on that front. And countries in the region are starting to realize as well that that China is an important player for sure, but that China is not interested in moving a lot beyond a kind of quite transactional relationship, very much based on trade and access to resources. And when it comes to the strategic relationship, China is not that interested in becoming too involved in this region. And the Red Sea, as the Gulf, is a region that is important. And as you mentioned, the base in Djibouti is showing that China is projecting some, starting at least to project a little bit its influence, but it remains, after all, a region that is far away from its core interest, which remains in the Asia Pacific at the moment, and so it remains a peripheral region for China's core interest at the moment.
Thank you, Hafsa. Just one last. We have a couple more minutes left, but on this first on the theme of China. I mean, is this Egypt has had good relations with China in the past. Obviously, much tighter relations with the U.S. and Russia at the moment. Is Egypt one of the countries that thinks about China's entrance on the regional scene as perhaps an opportunity to shape what China as an economic and political actor can do? I mean, there were Chinese investments in Egypt, not massive, and sometimes interesting. You must remember the New Yorker piece about some of the cities that the Chinese have built that were abandoned afterwards, or some of the industrial projects. So first that question over China, and second, Turkey. I mean, is there a sense in the region that Turkey has perhaps a whole of government broader approach because it invests so much in flights, in local economy, etc., than perhaps Egypt? Is that a fair comparison?
Thanks, Emil, and I'll be brief because I know that people, I'm sure, have evenings and days to get to. I think, so I actually think, I mean, China's investment in Egypt is quite significant, to be quite frank with you. And China across the region, whether it be Middle East or Horn or other parts of Africa, is a political actor with no conditions. Its aid, its economic support, ultimately on a political level, is unconditional. Obviously, we've seen the emergence across parts of Africa where, you know, default on debts and so on is now, you know, seeing the sort of, shall we say, fallout of accepting significant amounts of Chinese support and economic investment. And that's really a test for a number of Horn countries that have accepted quite large and substantial amounts of Chinese investments. I think Egypt, by and large, vis-a-vis BRI specifically in the Belt and Road Initiative, has been cautiously engaged. It hasn't gone full throttle and thrown all of its eggs in that basket, shall we say, whether it be on an investment development plan. We've had some hiccups in the road, be it with the infrastructure plans that the President Sisi has put forward in this country, the buildings of new cities, of new roads and so on. Chinese investment has stop-started in some areas and aspects. On other aspects, it's accelerated, and the investments are particularly in the sort of, I could call it the Suez Canal corridor and that free zone that's emerging, and other parts of the coastal areas along the Mediterranean. So there's certainly an opportunity. I think Egypt is largely engaged with a number of economic partners and interests that will not, I mean, ultimately it challenges, I wouldn't say it challenges the US-Egypt relationship directly or the EU-Egypt. Egypt remains the largest trading partner out in the southern neighborhood outside for the EU. But it certainly does provide another sphere of influence. And President Sisi, if nothing else in his foreign policy, has been about diversifying the opportunity and actors that Egypt has at its disposal, and at least attempting to show the United States that there are other options and other actors that Egypt can and will actively engage with. You know, Libya is a prime example of that. And that leads me to Turkey. I think the primary difference with Turkish engagement in North Africa, let's be frank, Libya, is primarily economic, but could easily develop into something more ideological. Egypt's investment in Libya and the Libya conflict on a particular side of the conflict, supporting Haftar in East Libya and his LNA forces and the extensions of that, is very much an Islamist, anti-Islamist agenda. It is the exporting of a domestic agenda implemented in 2013 that has created the legitimacy for President Sisi to not only come to power, but stay in power, and has propelled itself into a form of foreign policy. That is primarily why the Egypt-UAE relationship is so strong. Ideologically, they remain bound in that goal, which is why for Egypt, Turkey plays and is such a threat, even if Turkey's encroachment or aggression in Libya is not necessarily ideological, maybe possibly more economic, possibly to try to provide it leverage and broader continental shelf dispute and its own disputes in the East Med with Greece. But Egypt sees it as an ideological adversary. And that also includes looking in its rear view to the Red Sea, to Sudan, Turkey's attempts in 2017 to engage with Sudan, Suakin and other islands that it wanted to develop militarily. So Egypt is certainly much more directly threatened with Turkey as its ideological adversary. And just a final point on China, I think the Horn for China is much more, these days, is proving itself to be much more than just an economic opportunity in the extension of BRI with military presence in Djibouti and by extension of that, certain suggestions of expansion of military support, or at least military activity on a part of the Chinese, could see it develop in further years to be a much more substantive actor than merely economic.
Thank you very much, Hafsa, for all this. You know, this webinar has come to an end. We've been on it for over 90 minutes now. So thank you to all the participants who have spent 90 minutes with us. I hope you enjoyed it the way I did. importantly, thank you very much to the four of you, Ambassador Guyo, Julian, Camille, and Hafsa. It was rich. They will be a number of upcoming ISS publications on some of these topics in our publications. Something on the GERD. There's something on the Red Sea and on China and the region, etc. So keep an eye on our publications and on the publications and work of the rest of you. So thank you very much for your time. Apologies to everyone else and for not all the questions. And have a nice evening, afternoon, wherever you are, and goodbye.